The Mabo ruling is set to cause uproar, with claims it could lead to a form of apartheid.
Mabo continued to dominate.
Mabo opens with a montage of authentic news footage at the time of the Mabo ruling. This footage represents some of the opinions being expressed via the media and politicians at the time of the Mabo ruling. Note that the majority of this sentiment opposes the Mabo case, with Paul Keating being the only one out of the clips chosen who sees the case as a pivotal and positive step towards justice for the Indigenous community. The white Australian response to the Mabo case as presented throughout the film is not wholly negative. However, there is a significant amount of evidence that demonstrates how the settlers viewed this as a threat to their way of life. Director Rachel Perkins utilises authentic footage throughout the film to both inform the viewer and blur the line between the real events and their recreation to give the film an overall sense of authenticity.
National debate this week.
The economic and political future of Australia has been put at risk and our territorial integrity is under threat.
Mabo establishes a fundamental truth and lays the basis for justice.
This media footage is followed by establishing shots of the islands. This positions the land as a central focus of the film. After all, even though Koiki Mabo's name is the title of the film, the legal and political context of the land claims themselves are just as much the central concern of this film as he is. The non-diegetic harmonies of the traditional music playing in the background also helps to acquaint the viewer with the Indigenous culture. We get a strong sense of community because of the choral nature of this soundtrack.
Wablesai wabasikak nase serdawen. Dilsirawem omaskerasi sihe. Kairlo yawanagri mariwana kaila.
This sequence of young Koiki Mabo with Benny Mabo is a recurring motif throughout the film. It uses slow motion because it emphasises that this is a memory that shapes Eddie as a person and fuels his passion to pursue Indigenous rights. Events in our life that were particularly impactful to us as individuals can be remembered a lot more clearly than the scattered memories of other passing events. This use of slow motion reflects this clarity of detail. The quote, "Everything here is yours," is particularly significant with regards to the ideology that motivates Eddie Mabo.
Mama Gekar, Mama Nali.
We transition from the scene in the water to the one of Eddie dancing using a sound bridge, which is when the sound from one scene flows into another. This signifies how Eddie has grown from a young boy to a man with these teachings in mind. The traditional dance is also significant for Eddie, as participating in the dance strengthens his ties to his heritage and community. We later see him doing it after his unpleasant altercation with the law, having been drinking on the mainland. It strengthens his resolve to not go off track. We will see this later in the visual metaphor of this notion as he does the dance on the railway track. In the church scene, we get further insight into the way the Torres Strait Islanders celebrated Western religion with the influence of their own language and cultural traditions of music and singing. We can also hear from Mabo's voice that he is a little distracted from the singing. He has his eye on a woman of his interest, which is causing friction with her elders. This scene introduces us to Eddie as a bit of a nonconformist and troublemaker. We also get the sense that the women in his life have a big influence on him, which becomes even more significant when we later meet Benita.
Kanole abi tutida.
Mari are para boy gize mari nardarda. Ma barsire rabedorgem.
Kino batkapie.
Mari nardari ma barsire bedorgem ma usura riari gemanawer.
Katuba ari nawer.
When Eddie faces the Island Council, we get confirmation that he is considered a troublemaker in the eyes of authority, which is a significant factor in his character that plays a role in his case against the Australian government later on. In some stages of the film, the viewer might question why the Island Council, fellow Indigenous Australians, are so harsh on their own people. But remember, the two policemen who spotted Eddie are most likely white, and due to the way the white settlers have oppressed the Indigenous people, they are likely fearful of causing friction with the white authorities and prepared to make decisions in favour of keeping the peace. This notion is reflected later in the film when Benita tells Eddie that they can't afford to be troublemakers. This scene and the way Eddie is referred onto the Protector also informs the viewer about the extent of control the governing bodies of Australia had over the Indigenous community and the methods through which they exerted their power.
Koiki Mabo. Gelari de emetu mari naudbari.
Kalagla kari vermem.
Maumur kabatui.
Eno kebi verem dali.
Chlorine de napo dike par. Ma penali pema ma bakamu chlorine batomer.
Kebile basketa melanium. Biokata priklui kelila. Ma pema karanas bitu verem nali. Batawe ke berita. Okipa wam.
These words of Benny Mabo are useful quotes to remember, particularly about young men forgetting everything on the mainland and about how Eddie is his eldest son. Eddie tries very hard on the mainland to retain ties to his home, and we often hear voiceover flashbacks of Benny's words to him, encouraging him to retain his commitment to return to the island. We also later learn through the court proceedings that Benny Mabo is not Eddie's biological father. This information is used to undermine Eddie's land claims, but it is through Eddie's explanation that we learn that in Indigenous culture it is not uncommon to be raised by other members of the community. In Eddie's mind, he is Benny's eldest son, and this is why later on he is so upset by not being able to be with Benny on his deathbed. This becomes the huge motivating factor for him to change Indigenous rights. In this scene, Benny also talks about the wind, reminding the viewer of the close spiritual ties the Indigenous people have with the nature that surrounds them.
I want to exile you off the island for a year. I told him I could offer you a better alternative. Stay on the island, come work on my green truck.
What? With all them poor fellas carting garbage off the streets for not a red penny. Nah. Not Koiki Mabo. You got the wrong fella, Mr. Killeran.
How does it work, Eddie? The Act, remind me. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protection Act.
PJ Killeran is acted out like a typical villain character. He almost looks intoxicated or drunk in his facial expression, perhaps because he is intoxicated with power. Notice how he states the full title of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protection Act. This is not a natural thing to do in a conversation, but rather more likely another way of the film educating the viewer as to the political context that influences the events that are occurring. Notice how the camera use in this scene is a little shaky, perhaps a handheld camera. This technique is used to show how Eddie is on shaky or unstable ground metaphorically, and has little control over his circumstances. In this scene, it is because of the political oppression. Later on we will see the technique used again when he is intoxicated at Bonita's cousin's wedding. PJ Killeran is obviously trying to take advantage of his position of authority, while trying to appear as if he is doing Eddie a favour. Undoubtedly, there are some white Australian authorities who behaved like this in the past, creating injustice for the Indigenous community.
Right, what does it mean? Protection. You're too young, too hot-headed, and I protect you from yourself.
Notice how condescending Killeran is towards Eddie. He is very patronising. Later on in the film, he speaks to another Indigenous member of the community in a similar way, as if he is a school principal talking to a young boy who's in trouble, suggesting that he views Indigenous people as having a much lower social standing than himself.
I'll go to the mainland, work on the railways out west. They pay real money there.
But will you? Right, you got to pass the railway medical first, and you got a bad eye.
I'm not working as a slave.
Then go and say goodbye to Benny and Micah.